Oh, okay. That's what it was.
It was interesting really, really
He's only 6 years older now. Well, I mean, look, the obituary page is fairly regularly populated by names.
Here is. Thanks.
Well, he was born in 42. But
What comes up at the end, proposing a new international unit. I'm not sure we can sustain the metaphor. And I don't feel the need to go that far since we don't claim to be political science. She has to have her little theoretical component.
That's British. Doesn't want it either. I didn't tell you our friends, the Russians, were terribly busy. Poisoned Franco-German relations. But a large,
I know, but it's
come early. The American was never
Couple more minutes.
I mean, I didn't believe this stuff. Washington did about it. Let me tell you, and their religious, scriptural references to, their allied rights and these two governments and
Okay, why don't we get started? Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My name is Christian Osterman. I direct the History and Public Policy program here at the center, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this seminar on Mitterrand, the end of the Cold War and German unification. An event co-sponsored by two programs here at the center, the West European Studies program, as well as the History and Public Policy program. We have two distinguished speakers today, Dr. Frédéric Bozo and Dr. Samuel Wells. I'll introduce them in just a minute. Just to say that for those of you who are not on our listserv and are interested in receiving invitations to future events such as this, I think there's a sign-up sheet outside, or just touch base with me or one of my colleagues after the event. We'd be happy to put you on our listserv. Okay, we'll let these ladies and gentlemen get settled here. Very good. Well, welcome again. Let me briefly introduce our two speakers, and then we'll go right away to the presentations. Our first speaker is Professor Frédéric Bozo. He is currently Professor of Contemporary History at the Sorbonne in Paris. Was educated at the École Normale Supérieure, at Sciences Po, and at Harvard. Then taught for 7 years, if I'm not mistaken, at the University of Nantes, and then moved to the Sorbonne, to Paris, where he is also affiliated with the French Institute for International Relations as an associate. He's a former member of the Nuclear History Program, was honored with a senior fellowship at the Norwegian Nobel Institute in Oslo, and his recent publications, his recent books, include La Politique étrangère de la France, published in 1997, Two Strategies for Europe, The Gold, US and the Atlantic Alliance, published in 2001, and of course, Mitterrand, The End of the Cold War and German Unification, in French, which is the basis, the subject of his talk today. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here to the Wilson Center, Frédéric. Let me also introduce our commentator. He really doesn't need an introduction here at the Wilson Center. He is an institution within the institution, and I dare say in Washington. Sam Wells, the Associate Director and Director of West European Studies here at the Center. Sam received his master's and his PhD from Harvard in History and International Relations, taught for years at Wellesley, then for 13 years at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He founded the International Security Studies program here at the Center in 1977, directed that program until 1985, and has since served as Associate Director, Deputy Director of the Center. His numerous publications include Economics and World Power, an assessment of American diplomacy since 1789, Strategic Defenses and Soviet-American Relations, The Challenges of Power, American Diplomacy, 1900 to 1921, The Helsinki Process and the Future of Europe, New European Orders, 1919 and 1991, several co-edited volumes, as well as a recent article in the Center's Wilson Quarterly entitled Transatlantic Ills, and he's also co-editor, co-author of a forthcoming volume entitled The Strategic Triangle, France, Germany, and the United States in the Shaping of the New Europe. Delighted to have him here today on this panel as well. Let me also say a brief thanks to my assistant Ryan Gage, who's, I think, running around getting another event organized tomorrow, as well as Kalin Kanchev and Alton Bouland of the West European Studies programs for helping to set up this meeting. With that, let me turn it over to our two speakers. Frédéric will talk for about 20, 30 minutes. Sam will follow with a somewhat shorter comment and lead off the discussion that we'll have afterwards until about 5:30. Frédéric.
Well, thank you, Christian, and thank you, Sam, for giving me this opportunity to share my findings with a distinguished Washington audience and in this temple of Cold War historians. It's a great honor to be here. I wish I could do this on the basis of a book in English. I don't have one yet. It's only in French. I'm working on a translation which should, I think, appear in some time, but it's on its way. I'm conscious that it's difficult to explain France and especially French foreign policy in this country, especially at this time, and especially talking about these events which I'm now going to focus on. But I'll nevertheless give it a try. To do this, I'll do three things. I'd like first to say briefly why and how I decided to write this book. Then I will give a few insights into what I believe to be the main findings. And three, I will try to interpret those findings. And perhaps as a conclusion, I will sketch out the balance sheet of French policy at the end of the Cold War. First, why and how did I write this book? I think first to begin with a word on the state of the historiography of the Cold War, of the end of the Cold War, is in order. I won't dwell very long here on the importance of this field. It's of course obvious, especially at the Cold War, within the Cold War History Project and the Witten Center. So let me perhaps give a European point of view on the status of the historiography. It's huge. It's considerable. But I think, as seen from Europe, and especially from France, three remarks are in order with regard to what I would call the dominant narrative of the end of the Cold War. First, the reading of events remains mainly Soviet American in scope, essentially a bipolar narrative. Of course, it integrates other actors such as the Federal Republic of Germany, obviously, but it remains, as seen from Europe, essentially bipolar. Two, what predominates, as seen from Western Europe, is the narrative of the Western, if not the US victory in the Cold War. And I believe, even though I haven't read John Gaddis's book, that reading from the reviews, that is basically his line in his most recent book. So, a US or Western victory in the Cold War. And three, the end of the Cold War is often seen, in essence, as a top-down phenomenon that is strategic factors predominate and are more important than social factors or other factors, bottom-up factors, I would say. So, those three, I think, aspects, I think, leave room for maybe not reappraisals, but other narratives. And I think it's time now to focus on, let's say, the European contribution to the end of the Cold War, whether in terms of the role of West European countries, the West European construction, which I believe was a major element, largely underestimated in the current historiography, and social or ideological factors, what is now known as the Helsinki effect, the growing together of the both Eastern and Western societies. And I believe, rather immodestly, that my book perhaps contributes to this willingness to go beyond the present state of the historiography. This being said, the main incentive for me to write the book had to do with the state of the literature on France's role in these events. And there are several features that one has to be aware of without regard. First, France, like other European actors, is largely overlooked. in the current literature, and this applies, I think, also to the UK. Of course, there is in France and in French a large literature of memoirs, journalists, inquiries, etc., but there's very little academic work so far on the issue, except for one or two books, and I think it's time now to move on to a more scholarly appraisal of those events. Most important, French policies at the end of the Cold War, essentially German unification, but not only, and I will expand on this a little later, French policies are usually described very negatively. In essence, French decision makers have been unable to foresee the events. They were taken by surprise in the fall of 1989. More seriously, their role was essentially passive or reactive, if not completely negligible in those events. And finally, and this is of course the most serious part, French policies were fundamentally conservative, and they aimed at, in essence, keeping the status quo, the Cold War status quo, which was so profitable to France that it could hardly overcome it and was attached to keeping it. That is the dominant narrative. Hence, France tried to break down, if not to oppose outright, German unification, whether by Mitterrand's famous trip to Kiev to meet Gorbachev early December 1989, or by going to East Berlin late December 1989, and accordingly playing the game of artificially prolonging the existence of the GDR, or by indulging in pre-World War II alliances like with Margaret Thatcher in order to block unification. To give you just an example of how dominant this narrative is, both in scholarly work and in the media, I would quote the recent book by Tony Judd, Post-War, on this large history of Europe, in which he has a few pages on the topic. And his thesis is that Mitterrand indeed tried to block German unification. And 2 weeks ago in the Herald Tribune, an article taken from the New York Times by the New York Times correspondent in Paris, Ms. Cholino, which was written on the occasion of the 10 years anniversary of Mitterrand's death, in which she says, I quote, "During his 14-year reign, Mitterrand hid his cancer from the public," which is true. He tried to prevent the reunification of Germany and ignored the AIDS epidemic." In one sentence. That is an interesting putting together of two different kinds of... So this is a widely held view. And I would argue even in France. I mean, most French people are convinced that this is the case. And of course, there are many factors that can help explain this. First, there are elements in French policy at the time which can explain it. In particular, the lack of a grand speech or a grand discourse on the part of Mitterrand on German unification, but that can be accounted for, and I will come back to that. French domestic politics played a role. Mitterrand was re-elected in 1988 against Jacques Chirac, the current president. And in 1989, the accelerating of events in Europe, the fall of the wall, were used immediately by the opposition as a way to build up its strength against Mitterrand by trying to play the line that Mitterrand, in essence, had flanked the end of the Cold War. It can also be interested by the view of other actors, and especially the dominant view, and that means, in essence, the US view, which leaves little room for France and for other actors, because the US administration at that time took much credit for what happened in Europe, rightly so, but I think there are limits to that. And that explains, I think, that France, as the UK, are in a dead angle of the literature. And there's a final factor which is very important, and that is sources, French sources. And one of the most important factors explaining the very negative status of France's role in historiography is the work of Jacques Attali, François Mitterrand's special advisor for 10 years, who wrote a 3-volume book called Verbatim, which is a very misleading title, in essence, because the book presents itself as a diary and a compendium of his own writings at the time of the events. When one has access to archives, one immediately sees that 85% or 90% of the book is really documents written by other people than him, and that whenever he quotes documents, he does that with a certain liberty. Sometimes he cuts out sentences, in other that is more serious. He adds sentences, especially to verbatims, in fact, of heads of state. I have a pretty severe footnote in my book on that. He hasn't sued me so far, so I guess that means he confirms my judgment. But this book is a very, very strong basis for the negative, what I would call the black legend of French foreign policy at the time, and it's usually quoted even by very serious scholars who don't realize to what extent that source is to be criticized. So I decided to write the book because my own observations at the time were very different from that dominant narrative, and I, in essence, thought that French diplomacy was doing what it had to be doing, that it was rather faithful to the, in essence, the Gaullist approach of French foreign policy. And I thought I found this dominant interpretation completely at odds with the fundamentals of French policy since de Gaulle, which one should remember, were basically about overcoming the Cold War, completing Franco-German reconciliation, and of course pushing for the European construction. Now, it's very hard to reconcile the dominant narrative with these objectives, and I was intrigued, and I wanted to know what there was about, what the reality was. In order to write the book, I felt I had to follow a rather strict method. First, I believed I had to wait for the right time, which in essence meant waiting until the end of the 1990s to begin my work, essentially because the controversies were beginning to calm down. Most of the actors had left the scene, the last one being Helmut Kohl in 1998. Domestic controversies over Mitterrand and his own past, which are important, I think, also in explaining the bad reputation of his policies, his role during the war, Vichy, all of that was beginning to calm down also at the end of the decade. I also had to secure access to archives because the history is so controversial. My feeling was that nothing serious could be written until a wide access to archives, and I did get that access, whether in the National Archives, the archives of the President, the Quai d'Orsay archives, diplomatic archives, or private papers. I also felt that one had to have a very strict method of first establishing the facts. I'm not too much of a positivist. I know that facts are relative, so that also meant cross-examining sources and foreign sources, especially German sources, which are now available. Insert those facts and those events in a very, very precise chronological framework, because this is a time of acceleration of history, and when one says something on December the 15th, it's not the same as if one says something on January the 1st. And one has to be very attentive to that, very cautious about this very fine chronology. Only once events have been reconstructed could one start interpreting and then perhaps judging. So, what are the main findings of the book? I'm not going to summarize the book, of course, but I would just try to answer three questions, which I think are the main questions being asked currently. First, was French diplomacy taken by surprise by the revolutionary events of 1989? The answer must be nuanced, I think. It's clear that by the summer of 1989, before the acceleration of the German question, which is the center of the book, there was a French vision of the end of the Cold War, and there was a Mitterrand vision of the end of the Cold War, which was largely influenced by the Gaullist vision, dating back to the 60s. Mitterrand, it's clear, the evidence is very clear on this, had very well understood, since he took office in 1981, that the USSR was doomed, at least in the long term, that the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe was very shaky and could very well break down within a decade or so, or 2 decades perhaps. And most importantly, he clearly understood that the German question was still quite open. probably more so than his counterparts in the Western world, I would argue. And he told this, actually, to the German chancellors, Helmut Schmidt until 1982, and then Helmut Kohl. In those dialogues, it's Mitterrand who says, look, the German question is open, and unification will take place. And the Germans usually are more cautious, which can be explained, of course. It doesn't mean that they don't think of it, but they don't like to talk about it. Mitterrand is quite at ease with the topic, and he believes that the German question is still open. He understands perfectly the meaning of the arrival of Gorbachev for these questions, although, of course, he doesn't foresee the pace and the scope of the events that would evolve after 1989. But before those events accelerated, he clearly had a vision of a gradual erosion of the Cold War system, a progressive rapprochement between East and West, which was also influenced by the vision of Willy Brandt and Ostpolitik, with whom he had very good relations. So he has this vision, and a vision of a gradual rapprochement between East and West, which would, in the long term, solve the German question, or help solving the German question. Of course, he was taken by surprise, as many people were, by the fall of the wall and the rapidity of events, and he constantly was surprised by the degree to which the Soviets, and especially Gorbachev, were ready to accept the consequences of those events. And that had an impact on his policies. I will say why in a minute. So he had a vision, but of course he was surprised by the way things happened, and starting then, the question becomes, how do you reconcile that vision with the actual evolutions? Of course, he was not alone in being taken by surprise. I mean, most Western actors recognize, even Kohl, that they were taken by surprise. Second question, did French policy consist in trying to break down or to prevent, or in trying to prevent these events, and especially German unification? The answer is clearly no. Absolutely no. Of course, French diplomacy, and Mitterrand did not conceal it, would have liked a more progressive evolution. He actually said as much to his German colleagues, especially Kohl and Genscher. He didn't try to conceal it. And one of the things that struck me is that Mitterrand does not indulge in double language. He says the same thing to Gorbachev, to Kohl, and to Bush, which is rather remarkable when you know that Mitterrand is usually considered as a French Machiavelli in domestic politics. Well, in foreign policy, he appears to me as a very straightforward diplomat. That came as a surprise to me, but that's the fact, according to the evidence. So he didn't conceal the fact that he would have liked a more progressive evolution. And he says as much. But he's not alone. And in fact, other leaders, including George Bush Sr., did. It's very clear in their talk at St. Martin in mid-December 1989 between Mitterrand and Bush. Both of them would have liked a more progressive evolution. And Mitterrand's trip to Kiev and to Berlin in late December certainly signaled that. But there is not one single document or serious testimony that gives credit to the idea that Mitterrand actively tried to slow down or to block the process, whether in his meeting with Gorbachev at Kiev. In fact, at Kiev, it's more the opposite that's taking place. It's more the Russians that asked the French to try to do something to break down, to break the events, slow down the events. And in Berlin, in East Berlin, he talked a lot about German self-determination. As for his meetings with Thatcher, there's no doubt that Mitterrand was under a certain seduction when he talked with Mrs. Thatcher. He didn't like to contradict her. And that probably explains why she tries to pull Mitterrand in her direction in her memoirs. But they clearly completely disagreed on the status of Germany, the reliability of the German people and German leaders, and most of all, on the political consequences of German unification. We can come back to that in the discussion if you want. Fundamentally, it should be understood, at the risk of retrospective determinism, that a French policy of blocking German unification would have been completely absurd, because it would have meant basically taking the risk of shattering 40 years of French policies, of Franco-German reconciliation, European construction, with little chance of succeeding, because France, even with Britain and the Soviet Union, would have little chance of achieving such a result. And in fact, there was no legitimacy. There was no political basis for doing this, let alone legal basis. It's very fascinating to see how international law is taken seriously by diplomats. When you look at the archives of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there are a series of commitments, agreements, treaties that committed France and other great powers to German unity after 1950. And these were taken very seriously by French diplomacy. And, of course, one should never forget that, as I said in my introduction, Gaullist policies were founded on the premise that the Cold War should be overcome and German division overcome. So it would have been a major departure from what was the fundamentals of French policy. So what were French objectives? Well, I think they were rather clearly expressed by Mitterrand himself as early as July 1989. He was actually one of the first Western leaders to speak out openly in favor of German unity. But of course, provided this is done, he said, democratically and pacifically. Democratically, that meant free elections in the GDR. Of course, he didn't doubt that those elections would lead to a willingness to reunify Germany. But he insisted on that democratic process because he was a legalist, and he thought that the people should be consulted and democratic processes should be followed. And pacifically, this meant, of course, that the consequences of German unification, whereas German unification itself was a matter for the Germans to decide, its international consequences, especially in terms of international security, needed some kind of international agreement. Hence his insistence on several things, which I will discuss in a second, but essentially dealing with the leftovers of the past, that is borders and nuclear weapons, dealing with security, making sure that unified Germany and NATO would not be seen as a threat to the Soviet Union, and of course preparing for the future, and that had much to do with the European construction. So, what is the interpretation of what interpretation can one make of those facts? I think there were three main factors that weighed in France's policies at the end of the Cold War. First, of course, there was the weight of the past. There was no doubt that French diplomacy and Mitterrand personally were influenced by a reading of events that had much to do with his awareness of the lessons of history. After all, Mitterrand was a man of his generation. He was born in 1916, the year of Verdun. He was educated with a traditional education, European education of the time, reading in European history of the 19th century. He became a politician or came of age in the interwar period. He was, of course, completely influenced by that tragic European history. And, of course, the risk of a return of history, quote unquote, loomed large in European policies at the end of the Cold War, and Mitterrand's was no exception. But his obsession with what he called a return to 1913, and this sentence appears very often in his dialogues, had much to do with his obsession with finding ways to avoid that. He was not paralyzed by this fear, but he searched ways to make sure that we actually would not return to 1913. And one of the things to be done in his mind was to, as I said, settle the leftovers of the Cold War and the pre-Cold War period, including, of course, the border issue, which is why he insisted so much on the recognition of the Oder-Neisse line as a prerequisite to German unification. So the weight of history is important in his policies, but of course the weight of history is important in the policies of other actors, including George Bush, including Margaret Thatcher, and including, of course, the Germans themselves, and for good reasons. The second factor had to do with what I would call the imperatives of the present, that is, the need to steer the process of the end of the Cold War, and especially German unification, clear of its foreseeable obstacles. And the main such obstacle, in Mitterrand's view, is clearly the Soviet Union. Most of his policies were influenced by his conviction that all of this was possible because of Gorbachev and because of perestroika, and that overlooking the Soviet stake and the risk and going too fast without reassuring the Soviets could well derail the process and lead to the very opposite of what one wishes, that is, a return to the Cold War, a backfire, in other words. So most of his policies with regard to German unification, but also the European architecture after the end of the Cold War, the role of East European countries in that architecture, especially so his famous and failed project of a European Confederation. All of this is to be explained with the Soviet factor in mind. Do nothing that could derail perestroika and the Gorbachev experience. To finish on this, just 3 remarks. First, Mitterrand was right. It backfired, and the putsch, the coup in Moscow in August 1991 was, of course, an illustration of this. He was not alone in dreading such a backfiring of events. Again, Kohl, Bush also shared his preoccupation on that score. But he may have been less in a position to judge the actual capacity of the Soviets to accept the process, and especially of Gorbachev's capability to accept those evolutions, because he was not involved in day-to-day dealings on the key issues of the time, which were security and financial compensation for German unification. Finally, the third factor that influenced Mitterrand's policy was, of course, his vision of the future. And it's probably the most decisive factor. As other actors, French diplomacy at Cold War's end was strongly influenced by a vision of the post-Cold War Order, which, of course, was formed during the Cold War, and especially during the Gaullist period in the 60s and thereafter. And there are 3 goals, which, of course, are especially important in that respect. And I quote them in the order of importance. First, the European imperative. By the end of the 1980s, the European construction and the Franco-German rapprochement had become what I would call the alpha and the omega of French policy, French foreign policy and French European policy. Mitterrand and Kohl, after Mitterrand's landmark speech in the Bundestag on Euromissiles in January 1983, had embarked on a very, very strong and far-reaching bilateral rapprochement, and they had set out to relaunch the European construction, especially with the Single Act, and starting in 1988 with the European Monetary Union, Economic and Monetary Union project, the EMU, which would later become the Euro. This is the single most important issue as seen from France in European affairs when the events gather speed in the summer of 1989. And therefore, it's not a surprise that what little tension there was between France and Germany in those months, late 89, early 90, was not about German unification, but about its European consequences. Mitterrand, although he never doubted Kohl was committed to the European construction, was afraid that domestic German politics with unification in the backdrop would put the European construction on the back burner in Kohl's mind. And therefore, he went to great lengths in order to obtain from Kohl, in the run-up to the decisive Strasbourg EC summit of December 1989, a firm commitment on the part of West Germany for a calendar for the setting up of the EMU project. And he got that, which is to his credit. And to Kohl's, by the way. The same pattern applies to the political dimension of the European construction. And, of course, the most important consequence of these events in Franco-German terms is the decision to move from economic union to political union at Dublin in the spring of 1990, a process that would lead, as you know, to the Maastricht Treaty of late 91, early 92, which can be seen in the long run literally as a triumph of French policies, because it's very much what de Gaulle had unsuccessfully tried to get in the 1960s with the Fouché Plan, which is really consecrated in 30 years later against the backdrop of the end of the Cold War and German unification. It's very important, I think, for a US audience to understand that a united Germany that would remain committed to the European construction was exactly as important for France as a united Germany committed to NATO was important for the US. And when one looks at the two processes, US-German and French-German relations, there is a very clear parallel between the two. The Camp David meeting between George Bush and Kohl in late February 1990 is decisive for US policy, because that's when George Bush has this clear commitment on the part of Kohl that he will keep a unified Germany in NATO. It's exactly at the same time that Mitterrand gets the same assurance from Kohl on the European construction. Quickly, the second imperative was less important. It was the building of a wider Europe. The Confederation project, I don't have time here to dwell on it, but maybe we can address it in the discussion. And the third imperative, of course, was the rethinking of the transatlantic alliance. Logically so, seen from France, the end of the Cold War meant, according to the Gaullist reading of events, a probable reduction of the US presence in Europe, and therefore the need to build up the European actor as a strategic and political entity. And of course that played a very important role in Mitterrand's policies, both with regard to NATO. By the way, Mitterrand was instrumental in convincing Gorbachev that there was no other solution than a united Germany in NATO. This is usually not given credit to in the current literature, but it's very clear in the evidence. And this also explains Mitterrand's attempt to actually have an overhaul of NATO. It remained very secret until now, and the bilateral discussions between Bush and Mitterrand on that topic in 1990. So there was a French vision of the Cold War, of the end of the Cold War. That vision was different from the US vision, spelled out, for example, by Secretary James Baker in his famous December the 12th speech in Berlin, 1989. The priority for France was West European construction. The priority for the US was NATO. And that, I think, accounts for diverging views and diverging evaluations of French policy. So to conclude, the balance sheet, it depends how you look at it. If you look at it in the short term, I think it's fair to say that not only did Mitterrand's France not flank the end of the Cold War, or the exit from the Cold War, but actually managed to push through its objectives, West European construction to begin with, even though he was less successful in other regards, the Confederation or NATO. And that, I think, is a contribution to a rereading of the end of the Cold War, in which, again, the West European factor has to be taken into account much more seriously than has been done so far. I don't think events would have unfolded as gently as they have without the Franco-German relation and without the European construction. If you look at it in the midterm, that is in the framework of the post-Cold War period, especially the last decade of the previous century, the balance sheet is less favorable to Mitterrand, to France, because in essence, the post-Cold War order is very different from what he thought. There is the Yugoslav drama. The EU proves incapable of settling the crisis. The US has to be brought back in, and one witnesses a unique commitment of the US to European security. And the Atlantic status quo is basically confirmed by the 10 years after the first decade of the post-Cold War era. So this, in the light of that period, French policy was actually seen as very negatively because it could be seen as a failure. But if you look at it with the hindsight of 15 years, I think, again, the view changes. After all, September 11th may have marked the real end of the Cold War in Europe and globally, may have signaled a US withdrawal from Europe for good, even though there are relics of that presence today, NATO, for example. The US is simply no longer interested in European security the way it was during the Cold War and in the 10 years that followed. European unification has happened to the point of basically including all of the continent except for the Balkans. And the EU is building itself into a political strategic actor that is now largely in charge of European security. And finally, the Franco-German relationship, which was always an important but difficult relationship, has become probably more easy today as a result of a rebalancing of power between the two countries and a shared commitment to the European construction. So with hindsight, I think most of the things that are now unfolding in Europe would not have been possible without the decisions made 15 years ago, including by Mitterrand and Kohl.
Thank you very much, Frédéric. Sam, if you would like to lead off the discussion.
Sure. Well, I would just say that this was an excellent presentation to highlight the themes of the book. The book itself has an amazing range of sources for such a contemporary study, and it does an excellent job of providing a French analysis of French policy goals and methods. And that's something that has been missing. We were too dependent on things like Attali or other memoirs, which presented more of a personal view and sometimes a very flawed record of those personal views. It is clear, nonetheless, that Mitterrand and his advisors miscalculated seriously in thinking German unification could be delayed and would take a decade. Plus, that East European countries would keep socialist economies and maintain their ties to the Soviet Union. At this same time, with perhaps somewhat different information, U.S. and German leaders assessed the time frame and the prospects for rapid advancement quite differently. And even when French leaders saw that the process was moving much faster than they wished and was spreading to Eastern Europe, they did not adequately appreciate the thinking of the Germans, both East and West, nor of the leaders and political opposition in Eastern Europe. As a result, Mitterrand and his immediate circle framed policy discussions in a way as to make Kohl suspicious and to drive him even more deeply into support of the Bush administration's positions. The evidence is ample in Frédéric's volume. The French-Soviet meeting in Kiev, the meeting of the occupying four in Berlin late December, which in a classic instance not designed to make it seem like the opening of a new era to the Germans, was held in the old building of the Monitoring Council. Mitterrand's trip to the German Democratic Republic in late December, and further tension between France and Germany over the Polish frontier in the negotiations March and April of 1990. There were similar French miscalculations about the prospects for the Confederation of Europe and about what would really happen in what Frédéric quite rightly pinpoints as Mitterrand's overwhelming objective, the advance of the construction of Europe. What Mitterrand and his associates wanted was a construction of Europe which would cement Germany, a unified Germany, at the center and maintain the special relationship with France. They also wanted a Europe of the 12 that would deepen much before it widened. They didn't really get that to the extent that they wanted it or needed it. And one can read into part of the French defeat of the Constitutional Treaty this past spring, the dissatisfaction with those results. I've had the opportunity over the last 25 years to interview a wide range of French officials, diplomatic, security, economic. And I've always pondered why the diplomatic papers that one sees officially circulated between governments were different and were so subject to misunderstanding between France and its partners. And they were different from the explanations I would get when I would press officials to explain what they were really seeking, what the concept was in its fullest extent. And I concluded there are essentially typically three, as one would for France, reasons behind this. There is a consistent overestimation of the French weight in the councils of the great powers and of its persuasive capacity. One phrase that Frédéric uses from a document, the French, in starting to come to terms with the unrest in Germany and thinking what French policy would be, were confident in their shaping of this European construction because they felt, in his phrase, that France was the only one of the 12 members of the EU that had a coherent European vision. Well, they naturally would think that, but I dare say some of the other 12 thought they had a fairly coherent vision as well. and some of them may have been at least as accurate. Second, the French, in my experience, and as shown again by Frédéric, do not frequently enough modify their analysis of the fundamental forces when circumstances shift. They get the vision and they keep it. And the final and perhaps most mischievous reason why they so frequently get things wrong is they present their positions in abstract terms, sometimes ambiguous terms, leading to different interpretations by their partners than those they have themselves. For those who, in the words of our president, don't do nuance, this creates a problem.
Thank you very much, Sam. The floor is open. This event is being webcast live across the world, so I'd like you to please state your name and affiliation if possible. Yes. There's a mic, and please use the microphone for precisely that reason. Working? Yeah. Up here.
Thank you, Frédéric, for your brilliant presentation. And I wanted.
Could you state your name and? Could you please state your name
and
affiliation?
Michael Troitsky. I'm a Fulbright visiting scholar at the Kennan Institute here. And I'd like you to elaborate more on Mitterrand's vision for wider Europe that you just briefly mentioned and suggested we discuss it in Q&A. And the whole issue of this CSE summit in November 1990, was Mitterrand anxious to sponsor that summit because he wanted to offset the power of the unified Germany somehow, or because he believed in the Gaullist vision of the wider Europe somehow? And do you think this vision ultimately did not come true, or did it really come true? Thank you.
Rick?
Thank you very much for asking this question, because I didn't have time to dwell on this dimension, the pan-European dimension, which is traditionally important in French policy since de Gaulle, because he came up with this notion of Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals, a wider Europe with no division, and the French have theoretized this wider Europe since the 60s, and there it comes. The wall falls, and the Eastern European countries become democratic. So the question arises of how to organize this. The CSCE summit, yeah, of course it was a means for the French to keep the center stage in spite of German unification. But I think for Mitterrand was a skeptic of the CSCE. He believed that it had played an important role in the divided Europe, in the second part of the Cold War, but that it failed to grasp the real issues of the post-Cold War, and essentially how to anchor the East European nations in Western institutions, how to make sure that there were bridges built between Eastern Europe, which was becoming democratic but but lagging behind Western Europe in terms of economic development, while at the same time, and here I agree with some, while not taking the risk of an early enlargement of the EC. Hence his proposal to build a European Confederation, which he launched in December '89, but really did not work on until late 1990, at a time when things had changed radically, which explains partly the failure of the project. But it's very true that he was obsessed with bringing the East Europeans in, but not at the cost of diluting the European construction process. Therefore, as was foreseeable, the Confederation project was taking the risk of being seen as a way to delay, perhaps forever, the admission of the East European countries into the EC and NATO. In fact, other actors played on that fear. Clearly, US diplomacy, German diplomacy too, which was fair. I mean, that's part of the game. But first, there's evidence that Mitterrand perfectly understood that East European countries would join the European institution and the Atlantic institution at some point. There was no evidence that he wanted to exclude them from those institutions. He thought there was need for a time of consolidation of the European construction first, and that in any case, those countries were not yet ready for membership, which, by the way, proved right, because the first membership from the East European countries took place in 2004, so 15 years after the fall of the wall. But yes, I think the Eastern European dimension is probably the least successful dimension, and I think Sam has a good point. I think the French have a vision there, and they don't understand that the pace of events and the evolution of events take a different road. But Mitterrand understood it rather early on. I mean, he didn't insist much further, not much beyond the spring of 1991. And he understood that it was a lost battle anyway.
Sam, would you like to?
Wojciech Marston, National Security Archive. Actually, you started answering my question already. It was about the Confederation, which failed so miserably, despite the fact that it had a very sound idea. The fact that the East Europeans may not be ready for the Union for quite some time, and of course the jury is still out about that. So to help them to create something like the Partnership for Peace was for NATO.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? So why was it that, as I think you say in the book here, by the spring of 1991, the only country that supported the Confederation project was the Soviet Union? So was it the way it was presented? It was drafted in a hurry, you learn.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It was drafted by Mitterrand himself without consultation with pretty much anybody. Yeah? Was that the reason? Was it also because it was proposed by the wrong person or wrong country? Would such idea have fared better if it were presented by a different side? So I just wonder whether it was not the execution rather than the substance that doomed the project.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Wojciech, for your question. I can try briefly to answer your points. The wrong person, I don't believe so. I think Mitterrand had very strong credentials in Eastern Europe. At the fall of the Berlin Wall, from what I see in the documents, he was considered by dissenters in Eastern Europe as a very important figure. I mean, there are conversations with Valenza, with Havel in 88, 89, which show that Mitterrand is valued as probably the Western European statesman with the most far-reaching vision of the need to accompany Eastern Europe on its way to democratization. So I think he had very good credentials in the East. So it's not a matter of Mitterrand as a person, I think. I think you're right. It's a matter of presentation, of spin in a way. I mean, if the project had been presented as an intermediary project towards the membership of the East European nations into the EC, in spite of fudging that issue, it certainly would have been much more successful. Also, there's a distinct lack of Franco-German consultation on that score. In fact, Franco-German relations, I think, were more difficult after unification, against the backdrop of events in Eastern Europe and especially Yugoslavia, than during the unification process. And in the early months of 1991, when it would have been critical to have a serious Franco-German understanding on the Confederation, it didn't happen. Of course, West German policies were torn apart, as usual, between France and the US. And the early 1991 sees a very strong political recommitment on the part of the US. And in essence, they replay what happened in 1963. It's either the French or us. And it works.
Thank you.
My name is Stephen Shore. I'm with the PBGC, a wholly domestic federal agency. There's one aspect that you have not covered, and that was much of the official thinking in the mid-'80s, at least, was that the DDR was the 10th largest economy in the world, and that with unification, if that ever came about, Germany would be halfway to becoming a superpower again. And instead, the DDR was revealed to be a nation of Trabants, requiring far more investment from the West and almost a deflection of German interests that might otherwise have gone to a French vision of Europe. So to what extent did Mitterrand share this faulty intelligence of the state of the economy of the DDR, and was there a kind of fear, at least subconscious, of how strong Germany might be if it were ever reunified?
Mm-hmm. I think that's quite right. There's another misperception, which was the notion that vaguely the East Germans were a specific society, if not a specific nation, and that East Germany would survive the fall of communism because of a complex mix of socialism and Prussianism, and that existed also in France. But when you see American evidence, it's the same. There is that notion in cables from the East German embassy, according to the book by Mr. Zelikow and Mrs. Rice. That was a widely shared belief. As far as economics are concerned, absolutely, there was an overestimation of the real weight of the East German economy, and the collapse of that economy in January 1990 came as a complete surprise to the French. There is no doubt about that. Incidentally, I think that I would slightly disagree with Sam on the notion that the French misunderstood the pace of the evolutions. Remember that in December 1989, according to most testimonies, Kohl himself was thinking in terms of 5 to 10 years for German unification. In December 1989, right after his trip to Dresden. That's when Mitterrand does his trip to East Berlin. So, again, I think one has to be very careful about the precise chronology. The real acceleration in the German question is January 1990. It's when it's clear that there is no sustainability of the regime, of the economy, and that the only solution is quick reunification if we want stability.
Thank you. Gentleman here on the left side.
Thank you. My name is Philip Kaplan. I served as a Foreign Service officer for many years during the Cold War in Europe. I'm confused by a couple of things that you said in your brilliant analysis. One, you referred to the fact that Europe today is responsible largely for its own security as the United States presence fades, while acknowledging quite honestly and accurately that Jacques Pousse lived to regret his words about Bosnia. And secondly, you spoke about Mitterrand's security conception for post-Cold War Europe. I don't really have the slightest idea what that is or was, unless you're referring only to the fact that there would be an increasingly united Europe, which in and of itself would deter internecine disputes within Europe. Now, for the last 15 years, there's been a benign security environment in Europe, with the exception of the Bosnian troubles in the 90s. But the French have been famous for long-term thinking. People talked about how de Gaulle couldn't see what was right in front of him, but had a much better view than anybody else of what was down the road. So my question to you really is, if one looks down the road to a set of circumstances that might be less benign, with the United States in this conception playing a much reduced role from what it was before, what is the security basis for taking care of Europe's interests? It's not very hard to figure out some possible contingencies, such as a re-strengthened Soviet Union, or Russia, more properly, if you look not 2 years down the road, but 20. What's the basis for dealing with these kinds of issues? Or a Germany which becomes more nationalistic at some point, which I'm not predicting, but anything's possible. French history, and since 1913, in my reading, has been one of its reach exceeding its weight. And you won't be able to do it by yourself. And so far, the notion of a renewed EDC has not produced very much. I appreciate your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go to this gentleman here next, but Frédéric and Sam, feel free to chime in every time.
On this? Actually, I didn't anticipate a policy debate, but I'm glad to try maybe an answer to your question. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not trying to make the case of an autonomous Europe independent from the U.S. My only point was to say that the involvement of the U.S. in what I call European security, that is potential instability within Europe, which was the core of the security issues in the 1990s, that is almost gone. When you look at the actual U.S. participation in operations in Kosovo or in Bosnia, what was unthinkable 10 years ago is now happening. That is, the Europeans themselves are taking care of the problem. I was not trying to say that there wouldn't be no circumstances in which the Europeans would have to rely on the U.S. for their security, but these are challenges beyond Europe, global challenges in which, of course, the transatlantic partnership is very important and as important as ever. My analysis was really European focus. As to what you have to say about the EDC, well, perhaps we're lucky that the EDC never happened, because it was a rather flawed plan. But in spite of the recent failures of the European construction, including the failure of the referendum in France and the Netherlands, I think one should not underestimate what is at play, what has been at play in the past 5 to 6 years in terms of the building up of the EU defense entity, which, by the way, I think is a consequence of the Europeans feeling that the US is less and less interested in contributing to security in Europe, and that even the British acknowledge that. You can't explain the change of British policy with regard to European defense, starting at the Saint-Malo meeting between Blair and Chirac in '98, and then the Helsinki and Cologne meetings of the EU, without acknowledging that the Brits themselves understand that 10 years after the Cold War, now 15 years after the Cold War, the US will not always be around in Europe to do the jobs that the Europeans are best fit to do.
On the contemporary security capacity, I would just add to that the French and the British have small numbers of extremely able forces, and the trick will be in creating an autonomous European defense capacity to get the other members of the European Union to create forces that are both interoperable and compatible, to have niche specialized forces instead of 25 air forces and 25 communications brigades. They really have to divide it up and get a coherent force that can be operable on a fairly short notice. They're working toward it, but the defense budgets of many of the countries are inadequate to do that. So it's going to be a long-term process before they are really ready to roll.
Wayne Mary, the American Foreign Policy Council. Let me first mention that at the specialist level in the mid and late 1980s in the U.S. government, of people who knew something about East Germany, there was a very clear understanding of the weaknesses of the economy and the society, and that the GR was approaching systemic collapse. That had absolutely no impact on the policy level whatsoever. Warnings by the specialist level, of which I was part, that this was coming, received with incredulity and incomprehension totally. What I'd like to ask you to comment on is that obviously your presentation and probably the book as well are very much focused on the figure of François Mitterrand. But even in the Fifth Republic, there's more to French foreign policy than the president. And I'm wondering if you could talk just a little bit about the positions, the attitudes, the roles of the Quai d'Orsay and of the army. Because certainly in much of Europe and in Germany, these institutions gave a very good impression of wanting to maintain what you might call a conservative position, which is preserving the division of Germany and the Cold War division of Europe. To what extent did the vision that Mitterrand had that you have described permeate or at least override other biases within these institutions?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. I think when you look at the Quai d'Orsay, especially in that period, you have to distinguish between the minister himself and the ministry. The minister was Roland Dumas. He was a very close associate of Mitterrand. And he completely shared, I think, Mitterrand's operational code and vision. He has a very bad reputation, especially as seen from Germany, because he was the one who asked the difficult questions, especially on the German-Polish border. So he is not recognized as having been very helpful. But again, when you look at the evidence, at no point was this, for example, the border issue, a way to slow down events. Quite on the contrary, it was a way to make sure that events would progress on a stable and secure basis, that there would be no leftovers of the pre-Cold War period that could backfire at some point. And Dumas is very close to Mitterrand. As to the Quai d'Orsay itself, it's amazing to see how, in the long run, French foreign policy looks much worse than it actually is. The fundamentals of French foreign policy, ever since 1950, have been Franco-German reconciliation and European construction. And at no time in that process did they depart from that. There was no effort whatsoever to challenge the right of the Germans to unify. The willingness was to help and to be constructive. It's amazing to see that this maybe didn't show at the time as much as it should have, even though it was clearly recognized by many actors also at the time. But Sam, you mentioned for example, what General Walters, the U.S. ambassador to West Germany at the time, described as the worst photo opportunity of the century. And that was the meeting of the 4 ambassadors in Berlin in the control committee building. It's very interesting. When you look at, for example, this is details, but it's interesting. When you look at the book by Philippe Zaleco and Condi Rice, this is used as an example of French tactics to slow down events. And there was a quotation of some French diplomat quoted by Jim Hoagland of the Washington Post, to the effect that, yes, of course, this was a way to signal something to the Germans. But when you look at the evidence, the documents, it's fascinating to see that in the discussions at 4, among the 4 ambassadors, the one who is the staunchest supporter of the right of the Germans to unification is the French. General Walters is much more ready to compromise with the Soviets in the communique, in the drafting of the communique. The French were not at all interested in using the 4 powers' rights as a way to slow down events, because they perfectly well knew it was completely unacceptable for the Germans and completely in contradiction with Franco-German relations.
We'll go next to Tom Schwartz, and then to Jerry Livingston, and then to the lady on the left here has been patiently waiting, and then we'll go for the next round.
Yes, Tom Schwartz. I'm a public policy scholar at the Institute, or at the Wilson Center. Frederick, you know you're swimming upstream here, in a sense, and trying to make the argument that the French really favored German unification. The favorite story, or the joke always told, was that France loves Germany so much they wanted more of them, or 2 of them, and that was the way in which it was looked at during the Cold War era. I want to push a little bit on the question you just asked as to whether there weren't institutions within the French state that might have been more conservative in expressing this view than some of the political leaders who, of course, had to recognize, I think, when conditions get out of hand and to adapt to them. But also, on the question of the Thatcher-Mitterrand relationship, since we don't have British documents, on what do you base your view that Mitterrand was simply under Mrs. Thatcher's spell as opposed to actually agreeing with her in some sense in her argumentation? And in that sense, where can you be as definitive about that particular relationship and that notion of a British-French resistance to reunification as it sounds like you are?
Mm-hmm.
Why don't we just take a couple more questions, since we're getting close to the end of the session. So Jerry Livingston, another gentleman here, right up here in the middle.
I'm Jerry Livingston from the German Historical Institute, and I have two questions, one about a rumor and the other about a puzzle, and I hope the one about the rumor isn't too down and dirty for these halls. And that is, during the 1980s in Germany, the rumor used to circulate that when he was a prisoner of war in Germany in 1940 and 41, Mitterrand left an illegitimate child there. Can you confirm that? And my second question is, relates to the puzzle. Can you say a little more and explain what moved Mitterrand to pay this visit to the GDR at the moment when it was virtually collapsing? No Western statesman had paid this sort of a visit. And did he consult Kohl before he went there?
Okay, here, and we'll take one more, and then we'll do more.
Vera Wolf, Fulbright scholar. Well, my question is, in the year 91, Mitterrand didn't recognize, or didn't hurry to recognize the victory of Yeltsin in Russia. Then, just more than a year ago, in Ukraine, Chirac wasn't hurrying to recognize the victory of Orange Revolution in Ukraine. And these both, to my mind, were mistakes. Well, but does it mean that the policy from the times of Mitterrand towards the Eastern European states hasn't changed?
Briefly, Frédéric.
Briefly. I'm not sure about your qualification of Chirac's policy with regard to Ukraine. I think the EU in general has had a policy of recognizing the importance of democratic movement in Ukraine. I don't think the French were especially different from the rest of the 25 on that score. As to Mitterrand and Yeltsin, I don't have the time here, but if you read my book, you'll see that there is a very strong parallel with the French and the US attitudes with regard to the breakdown of the USSR. Shared caution, willingness to make sure that it doesn't backfire. That explains, I think, the treatment of Yeltsin by Mitterrand and by Bush, Senior. Mitterrand's illegitimate children, that's always a good bet. But on that one, I don't know, I must say. As to the GDR, I'm afraid you overlooked the fact that Secretary James Baker was in Berlin a week before Mitterrand. And he went there precisely because he knew Mitterrand was going. And he thought it was important to have a Western presence in East Germany. Did Mitterrand and Kohl consult over the trip? Yes, of course they did, intensively. The trip had been scheduled many months before as a return invitation from Honecker to Mitterrand. Of course, the acceleration of events called the trip into question. But Mitterrand consulted Kohl, and evidence is very clear both on the French and the German side. And Mitterrand says to Kohl, should I go? I don't know who is going to be in charge when I go there. Do you think I should go nevertheless? And Kohl says, absolutely, there is no reason why you shouldn't go. Please go and see by yourself. So not only was there consultation, but a complete green light on the part of Kohl. And that's in the volume of the Chancellery. It's very easy to check. Why did Mitterrand go? Absolutely not, as far as I've seen the evidence, because he wanted to artificially have the GDR survive. It doesn't make sense to think that, if only because nobody believed that the GDR would die in 3 months at the time, in December '89. Again, people thought that it would be there for 5 years at least. He went there because he wanted to see what happened there. He was curious to judge for himself. And again, the evidence of what he had to say with the East German leaders, what he had to say in public meetings, was basically about stressing the right of self-determination of the Germans, provided, of course, they make a certain amount of gestures. Tom, the Mauriac, because it's a Mauriac sentence. I love Germany so much that I prefer to have 2 of them. You don't make history with slogans and with rumors and with quotes like this. I think you need serious work in the archival material. I know you share that view. I know this is an upstream exercise from an uphill battle, but I refer you to my book and to the 1,400 footnotes. If you have the patience to go through them. Now, various other institutions with different views of the German question. I'd just say 2 things. French public opinion was overwhelmingly pro-German unification, to the same level of US public opinion. And if you look at the polls, it's very clear. And it's it's a major difference with the UK situation, in which the UK public opinion was much more reluctant, if not negative. So that's one answer. The French public opinion was largely in favor of German unification, and Mitterrand knew it, of course. And that can be explained. I mean, again, 40 years of Franco-German reconciliation. It makes a difference. Some elements of the political class had doubts. The former president, Giscard d'Estaing, was rather awkward in his questioning, not the legitimacy, but the risks of German unification. But these were only a very small spectrum of the political class. There was one minister in the Mitterrand government which was reluctant or anxious, and there was Jean-Pierre Chevènement, who knows Germany well, but he has also specific views about Germany. But he was very isolated, I think, in that view, in the government. Thatcher and Mitterrand. The evidence is the verbatims of their, the minutes of their conversations, especially the important conversation they had in late January 1990. And in that conversation, as in other conversations, it always starts with the lessons of history, professed by Mrs. Thatcher, sometimes with maps of the Germany of the 1930s, which she takes out of her bag and she lectures, and Mitterrand listens, and he doesn't dare to contradict her. But at some point he begins to say, but this is not the Germany of the 1930s, they have changed. He takes the risk of being, of contradicting her. But he doesn't like to do that, clearly. And that, I think, explains why in her memoirs, she essentially says, Mitterrand was in agreement with me in the need to block German unification, but he didn't dare to say it publicly. But the rest of the conversations is usually about what do we do? And so Thatcher says, well, we should use the four powers right, and we should forbid German unification. Mitterrand says, it doesn't make any sense. You can't do that. And then Thatcher says, but you should stop indulging in European construction with the Germans. They're going to absorb you in the European construction. You should be Gaullist. She thinks Gaullism means being, a sovereign state which opposes the European construction. She has a very strange view of Gaullism, which is close to Thatcherism, in fact. And of course, Mitterrand, cannot deliver. I mean, his policy is completely different. He is engaged in the European construction. As to his view of the Germans, there is a terrible sentence in Mrs. Thatcher's memoirs, which I think says it all. She says about the Germans and about her feelings with regard to Germany, she says, I did not believe in collective guilt, thank you, but I believed in national character. That is not an understatement. Now, Mitterrand's view of Germany cannot be, it's 1,000 miles away from that. His own personal experience, his historical experience, is exactly the opposite.
I think we'll take one final round of questions, starting with Jos Dulfa up to the right, front right here. And then the gentleman back.
Jos Dulfa, Konrad Adler, visiting professor at Georgetown University. What you presented essentially was the continuity of Mitterrand's assessment of French-German roles. And was there no, reconsidering that the future Germany must be greater, more important, and that the respective roles of France and Germany, which had been established over several years, would be changed somewhat. Germany would be a different kind of state in Europe after unification, and I feel Mitterrand would have thought about that at some time.
Thank you. Yes.
Judith's friend, George Washington University Emeritus, having jumped in nearly 7 years ago to write a book about Mitterrand, I have been trying to think through the consequences of the referendum on the European Constitution and see whether there was anything that Mitterrand did or did not do that led to that. The vote on the referendum on the Maastricht Treaty showed a very strong trend which is not too dissimilar from the trend of the 2004 referendum, which is to say that more people who would not have voted for Mitterrand at any time voted in favor of Maastricht and voted in favor of the referendum, and the socialists were weak on both of those things. But Mitterrand, by 1991, did not really control the Socialist Party anyway. So the question is whether Mitterrand, in looking for a Europe which was economically more unified, but politically still gave France the same kind of role that Britain wanted, was not creating a contradiction in terms which was bound to be weak and which, when looked at by doubters, would say, I don't know that we can do this. Mitterrand did not fight very hard. He was overconfident when he called the referendum. And I think that to some slight degree he bears a responsibility for what happened much later.
Thank you.
I'd like your comment.
Final question. Anybody else? Well, we'll go with this then, and concluding round. Frédéric.
Thank you. I can try to answer both questions at the same time. I think Mitterrand had believed that German unification would, in fact, change the policy of Germany in Europe. That Germany would become more assertive, and that this was a fact of life, and that because that would happen, there was a need for a European framework in which to make sure that this would not get out of control. So he did expect a more assertive Germany. Actually, it didn't really happen until the late 1990s, when you think of it. And it was really under Schröder that Germany became more assertive in a more Gaullist way, so to say. But when it happened, the balance of power between France and Germany had changed considerably, and it was not what was anticipated in the late 1980s, that is a dominating Germany in Europe, and France reduced to a second role. The economics, the demography of both countries, for one thing, have made them closer in terms of power after a decade or 15 years than expected. So that makes it easier, I think, to deal with the Franco-German relationship today. Now, for on the referendum, of course, Maastricht was a compromise, as always, between the more federalist view of the Germans and the more Gaullist view of the French. But for one thing, again, I think both countries have converged in the next decade or so. When you look at the Constitution, which is to a large extent influenced by Franco-German cooperation on many important issues, what you see is a more Gaullist Germany and a more federalist France. And they have, I think, found a common ground in their vision of the institutional dimension of the European Union to a much higher degree than was foreseeable at the time of Maastricht, for example, which again was, of course, a shaky compromise, but a needed one. Now, on the referendum, I think that it's Maastricht 1992 and the Constitution 2005 are very different when you look at French public opinion. Even though it's far-fetched on the part of those in favor of the no, especially the Socialist Party, to say that it was a European no. In other words, not a no to the Constitution per se or to the European construction, but a no to the present state of the European unification. There is something to it. And French public opinion is much more in favor of European construction in 2005 than it was in 1992. The case, in fact, can be made that it's because they take it for granted that the European construction will go on and should go on, that some voters decided to vote no because they were dissatisfied either with the French situation or, in fact, with the economic social model that the EU is developing, on which they find too liberal, quote unquote. And in fact, for one thing, they want more Europe than less Europe. They want a more protective Europe, a more socialist Europe than no Europe at all. I think at the time of Maastricht, it was much closer between, the balance between those in favor of the European construction and those opposed to it on national grounds, that balance was much more equal. Today, the vast majority of the French are in favor of the European construction, in spite of the referendum result. What I think weighed much more on French voters was enlargement, as Sam mentioned earlier. And here Mitterrand was right. This worry that, I think this is shared by many Germans, by the way, that we have been going too far in enlarging. We haven't taken the time of the transition, and therefore we are in a situation in which the EU is divided economically, that there is unfair competition on the part of the new EU members, etc., etc. So I think enlargement weighed much more than the consolidation itself of the project in the French no.
Thank you. Sam?
Well, I would just say that, as you can tell from the presentation and from the answers to the questions, Frédéric has a wonderful grasp of these issues, and when the book comes out in English, I would urge you to buy it.
Very good. Well, thank you.
French also.
Thank you both for terrific presentations. Thank you for coming and sharing your questions and comments, and look forward to seeing you again at the Wilson Center some other time. Thank you.
And supposedly during the occupation, yeah, and when I asked him about that, said he didn't think there was
Oh yes, you were the guy who brought us up to the 6th floor.
In fact, I asked, I've never read a biography of Hitler, and I'm not going to read more than one. Which one is the best?
Well, it's not in there.
Isn't it fairly well Oh, no, that's oh, yeah, that's
She's very public.
Why don't you just come in? I'll be in my
Oh, yeah.
Helen Wang wanted a series of biographies. American diplomatic figure.
Well, there's been plenty of reasons that you should have any problem with that at all.
Well, that is funny.
We know each other.
Yes, we do.
I might say I'm a fellow of German Storyography also.
There are all these, that's right.
It's always fun to be here.
So you're at West.
Yeah, I mean, I could have.
more.
I'm here till June. 6 months I've been spending half my time here. I'm trying not to be simply relying on secondary sources and looking as much as I can at some of the newer materials and trying to get some reading.
I guess my thing now. Yeah, one thing I think is the journal.
So that's what I'm trying. I mean, I hope taking my part of my thinking is I should be able to find one in Germany.
Yeah, there that's because I've done it for a month.
Well, but one of his brothers said about the kitchen through the yes, I missed that one. It's a telephone conversation.
And then I have time.
Yeah.
So I have to spend a lot of time. That's right.
Yeah, particularly with Nixon's anti-Semitic remarks. There's an interesting passage.